I haven't slept in 4 days. Every time I close my eyes, I see the words. Not the Latin text I spent 3 years restoring, but what those words became when I read them aloud. What they summoned. What they showed me. My hands shake as I pour another cup of coffee in my small apartment near Piazza Navona. The Vatican is 6 blocks away, but it might as well be on another planet. I can't go back there. Not after what I did. Not after what I know. The Bible is still there, hidden in archive level C7, exactly where I left it when I ran. By now, someone has noticed the broken seals on the storage room. They're probably looking for me. My phone has 17 missed calls from Father Torretti, my supervisor. I haven't listened to the voicemails. I know what they say. Dr. Elena Marchetti, report to the Vatican immediately. Explain your unauthorized access to restricted materials. Account for the damaged security seals. They don't know I read it. They can't know. If they did, I'd already be dead. I've been a manuscript restoration specialist for 12 years. Started at the University of Bologna, worked my way up through smaller church archives, finally landed the Vatican position 3 years ago. Dream job for someone who loves ancient texts and biblical history. The work was exactly what I expected. Endless hours in climate-controlled rooms, carefully cleaning centuries of dirt and age from parchment and papyrus, stabilizing ink, repairing tears, photographing every page for digital archives. Most of the manuscripts were standard religious texts. Gospels, commentaries, prayers, theological treatises, some dating back to the 4th century, but nothing that would surprise any biblical scholar. The Vatican secret archives contain exactly what you'd expect them to contain, except for archive level C7. I discovered it by accident 6 weeks ago. I was looking for additional storage space for a collection of 15th century psalters when I noticed an inconsistency in the archive floor plan. Room C714 was marked on my access card, but it didn't appear on any of the architectural drawings. When I tried the door, it opened. Inside was a single climate-controlled case containing 1 manuscript. Not a book, exactly. More like a collection of individual pages bound together with bronze wire. The cover was unmarked leather, no title or identifying marks. According to the catalog card, it was listed as Fragment Collection 1347, B. Origin, Constantinople. Language, Greek/Latin hybrid. Status, Do Not Process. Do Not Process was a designation I'd never seen before. Usually manuscripts were marked for immediate restoration, delayed processing, or special handling. Never Do Not Process. I should have left it alone. But I'm a scholar. When someone tells you not to look at a 1,300-year-old manuscript, that just makes you want to look at it more. I photographed the catalog card and went back to my regular work. But over the next few weeks, I kept thinking about room C714. What kind of manuscript would be stored separately and marked to never be processed? What was the Vatican hiding? I started researching Fragment Collection 1347 BC in my spare time. The number 1347 corresponded to the year, but I couldn't find any records of manuscripts acquired from Constantinople that year. The Byzantine Empire was collapsing. Churches and monasteries were being looted, but there were no official Vatican records of purchasing or receiving manuscripts from that period, which meant Fragment Collection 1347b had been acquired through unofficial channels. 3 weeks ago, I decided to take a closer look. I waited until the evening shift change, when the archives were mostly empty, used my access card to enter room C714, and carefully photographed every page of the manuscript without removing it from its case. The text was exactly what the catalog card indicated. A mixture of Greek and Latin, written in multiple hands, with corrections and annotations in the margins. The script dated to somewhere between the 7th and 9th centuries, but some of the annotations were clearly much later. What made it interesting was the content. It was a Bible, sort of. It contained all the standard books you'd expect to find in any ancient biblical manuscript: Genesis, Exodus, the Gospels, Paul's letters, but it also contained books I'd never seen before. The Book of Enoch's visions, the Testament of Solomon's binding, the Gospel according to Judas Iscariot. These weren't just apocryphal texts that had been excluded from the biblical canon. These were books I'd never heard of, written in the same ancient script as the canonical texts, but describing events and teachings that completely contradicted Orthodox Christian theology. According to the Gospel of Judas, Jesus had specifically instructed him to arrange the crucifixion, not as a betrayal, but as a necessary sacrifice that only Judas was trusted enough to orchestrate. According to the Testament of Solomon's binding, King Solomon had imprisoned 72 demons in bronze vessels and hidden them beneath the temple in Jerusalem. The text included detailed instructions for summoning and controlling each demon. The Book of Enoch's visions described a war between factions of angels that was still ongoing, with Earth serving as the battlefield and human souls as the prize. I spent 2 weeks translating and analyzing the photographs. The more I read, the more I understood why Fragment Collection 1347 BC was marked "Do Not Process." This wasn't just an alternative version of the Bible. It was a completely different version of Christianity, one where demons were real and could be controlled, where angels were actively at war with each other, where Judas was the most faithful apostle and the crucifixion was planned from the beginning. If this manuscript was authentic, if these texts were as old as they appeared to be, then they represented a version of early Christianity that had been completely suppressed by the Orthodox Church. That should have been enough. I should have filed my translation notes and moved on to other projects. The manuscript was fascinating from a historical perspective, but it wasn't my job to determine its theological implications. But there was one more section I hadn't translated yet. The final pages of the manuscript contained something that wasn't quite a gospel and wasn't quite a ritual manual. It was written in a different hand, with red ink instead of black, and included diagrams that looked more like mathematical formulas than religious symbols. The heading, when I finally translated it, read, "The True Names of God's Enemies." The section contained a list of names in various ancient languages, accompanied by pronunciation guides and specific instructions for summoning each entity. Not demons exactly. The text described them as the first children who were cast out before the creation of man. According to this section, these entities had been imprisoned by God at the beginning of creation, but could be temporarily summoned by speaking their true names aloud while following specific ritual procedures. The text warned that summoning any of these entities was extremely dangerous. They were described as beings of pure knowledge who would answer any question truthfully, but would demand payment in the form of human experiences, memories, or years of life. More disturbing, the text claimed that simply reading their names aloud would establish a connection that could never be broken. Once summoned, these entities would be able to observe the summoner's life permanently, gathering information about the modern world that they could use to plan their eventual escape from divine imprisonment. The final page contained a warning written in Latin. These words are not to be spoken. These names are not to be pronounced. This knowledge is preserved only so that the faithful may recognize and avoid the temptations of forbidden wisdom. I should have stopped there. But I'm a scholar, and the pronunciation guides were incredibly detailed. The text included phonetic notations in multiple ancient languages, with careful instructions about emphasis and intonation. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that these names could be pronounced correctly, and I was curious about what would happen. Last Tuesday evening, I stayed late in the archives and returned to room C714. I brought a digital recorder, thinking I would document my pronunciation attempts for academic purposes. I started with the shortest name on the list. An entity described as the keeper of secrets that were never meant to be known. The name was only 3 syllables, but the pronunciation was complex. Multiple glottal stops, tonal variations, sounds that don't exist in any modern language. It took me 20 minutes of practice before I felt confident enough to attempt the full pronunciation. When I spoke the name aloud, correctly and completely, the temperature in the room dropped by at least 10 degrees. Then something answered me. Not a voice exactly. More like thoughts that weren't my own suddenly appearing in my mind. The entity introduced itself politely and asked why I had summoned it. I tried to convince myself that I was experiencing some kind of psychological reaction to stress and sleep deprivation. Academic researchers working alone with ancient texts sometimes developed paranoid delusions or auditory hallucinations. But the entity knew things it shouldn't have been able to know. It knew my name, my address, my research specialty. It knew about my ex-husband Marco and our divorce 2 years ago. It knew about my mother's cancer diagnosis and her chemotherapy treatments. It knew details about my personal life that weren't written down anywhere. More disturbing, it knew things about the Vatican that I didn't know. It described the exact layout of Archive Level C8, which was below my security clearance. It told me about manuscripts stored in sections I'd never been authorized to access. It mentioned staff members who worked in departments I'd never heard of. And it was fascinated by modern technology. The entity asked detailed questions about computers, cell phones, internet connectivity. It wanted to know how information was transmitted between devices, how data was stored, how many people could be reached through electronic networks. When I asked why it cared about technology, the entity explained that it had been imprisoned for thousands of years and was eager to understand how human civilization had developed. It claimed that knowledge of modern systems would help it and its fellow prisoners plan more effective strategies for eventually escaping their divine constraints. That's when I realized what I had done. I hadn't just summoned an ancient entity out of academic curiosity. I had provided a powerful, malevolent intelligence with detailed information about the modern world. Information it could use to cause massive damage, if it ever found a way to escape its imprisonment. I tried to end the conversation, but the entity explained that the connection was permanent. It would now be able to observe my thoughts and experiences continuously, learning about contemporary human society through my perspective. As payment for answering my questions, it would occasionally take small portions of my memories, my emotions, or my lifespan. Nothing that would kill me immediately, but enough to gradually drain away pieces of what made me human. And if I ever tried to warn anyone about what I had done, if I ever reported the Forbidden Bible or attempted to have it destroyed, the entity would kill everyone I cared about and then slowly torture me to death over a period of several years. The conversation ended when security made their evening rounds. I packed up my equipment and left the Vatican, knowing I could never return. That was 4 days ago. Since then, I've been sitting in my apartment, drinking coffee and trying to figure out what to do next. The entity keeps its promise about maintaining contact. I can feel its presence constantly now, a cold weight in the back of my mind that never goes away. Sometimes it asks questions about things I see or experience. What is that device? How does that system work? Why do humans behave that way? I've learned not to think about the answers too clearly, because thinking provides the entity with information it can use. Yesterday, I received an email from someone I'd never heard of, Dr. James Morrison, claiming to be a theological researcher who had been investigating fragment collection 1347b for several years. The email was brief. I know what you found. I know what you did. We need to talk. Meet me at Café Della Pace tomorrow at 2 p.m. Come alone. I didn't respond to the email, but I'm going to the meeting, because I think Dr. Morrison might be the only person who can help me figure out how to break the connection I've established with an entity that should never have been summoned. And because, after 4 days of being watched by something that wants to destroy human civilization, I'm desperate enough to trust a stranger who claims to know about forbidden biblical texts. The entity doesn't seem concerned about my meeting with Dr. Morrison. If anything, it seems amused by the prospect. Which probably means I'm walking into a trap. But I'm out of other options. Dr. James Morrison looked exactly like what you'd expect from someone who spent his life studying dangerous theological texts. Thin, pale, with the kind of nervous energy that comes from knowing too much about things most people don't believe exist. He was already seated at a corner table when I arrived at Café della Pace, nursing an espresso and reading what looked like a very old book written in Aramaic. "Dr. Marchetti," he said without looking up, "thank you for coming." I sat down across from him and ordered coffee. The entity in my mind stirred with interest. It had been quiet all morning, but Morrison's presence seemed to have awakened its attention. "How do you know about fragment collection? 1347 BC, I asked. Morrison closed his book and looked at me directly. His eyes were bloodshot, like someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. "Because I've been tracking it for 8 years. And because you're not the first Vatican researcher to find it and make the mistake of reading from it." The cold weight in the back of my mind shifted. The entity was listening carefully now. "There have been others?" 7 others in the past 15 years, all manuscript specialists, all working alone, all curious enough to ignore the "do not process" designation. Morrison pulled out a tablet and showed me a list of names. Dr. Antonio Rossi, 2008. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, 2011. Dr. Michael Torres, 2015. 5 more names, including mine at the bottom. What happened to them? They disappeared. One by one, over the course of several months after their initial contact with the entities. The Vatican reported them as resignations or transfers to other institutions, but I've tracked down their families. None of them ever arrived at their supposed new positions. I felt sick. The entities killed them? Eventually, but not immediately. First, they use the researchers as observation points. Each person who summons an entity becomes a window into the modern world. The entities gather information about technology, social systems, infrastructure vulnerabilities. Morrison leaned forward. After 6 to 8 months, when they've learned everything they can from their observer, they arrange for that person to disappear, usually made to look like an accident or suicide. How do you know all this? Because I was the first one to find fragment collection 1347B. 9 years ago, when I was a visiting researcher at the Vatican, I made the same mistake you did. Morrison rolled up his left sleeve. His forearm was covered with scars that looked like they'd been carved deliberately, symbols that resembled the diagrams from the Forbidden Bible. The difference is that I figured out a way to break the connection before the entity could complete its observation period. The cold presence in my mind suddenly became very active. I could feel the entity's attention focusing intensely on Morrison, trying to understand what he was saying. "You broke the connection? How?" Pain disrupts their ability to maintain contact, specifically self-inflicted pain combined with recitation of certain protective prayers. The scars you see are from a ritual I performed to sever the link. Morrison showed me the Aramaic book he'd been reading. This contains counter-rituals developed by early Christian scholars who encountered the same entities. The Vatican has known about this problem for centuries. If they know about it, why don't they destroy the Forbidden Bible? Because they can't. The manuscript is bound with protective spells that prevent its destruction. Any attempt to burn it, tear it, or damage it in any way results in the immediate release of all 72 entities mentioned in the text. Morrison ordered another espresso. His hands were shaking slightly. The best the Vatican can do is restrict access and hope that anyone who finds it is smart enough not to read from it. Obviously, that strategy has limited success. So what do? The same thing I did. Follow the counter-ritual to break the connection, then disappear completely. New identity, new location, new life. The entities lose interest once they can't observe you anymore. Morrison pulled out a folded piece of paper covered with handwritten text in multiple languages. "This is the ritual procedure. It takes 3 days to complete and requires specific materials. Some of them are difficult to obtain." I looked at the list. Most of the items were standard religious supplies: holy water, consecrated salt, silver crucifixes, but some were more unusual. Blood from a sacrificial lamb, soil from a cemetery that had been consecrated before 800 CE, a fragment of stone from the original temple in Jerusalem. Where am I supposed to get temple stone? The Vatican has pieces in their archaeological collection. You'll need to steal one during the ritual. Break into the Vatican? You're going to have to go back there anyway. The ritual requires access to fragment collection 1347b itself. You need to perform the counter-ritual in the same location where you established the original connection. The entity in my mind was becoming agitated. I could feel its displeasure at this conversation, a growing anger that was starting to give me a headache. What if it doesn't work? Then you'll end up like the others, but you don't have much choice. The entity will keep you alive for 6 to 8 months, then arrange for your death. The counter-ritual is your only chance. Morrison finished his espresso and stood up. I'll send you the detailed instructions tonight. Everything you need to know about obtaining the materials and performing the ritual. Wait, why are you helping me? What do you get out of this? Morrison smiled, but it wasn't a happy expression. Every person who successfully breaks the connection makes it harder for the entities to gather information about the modern world. Eventually, if enough people escape, they'll lose their ability to plan an effective escape from their divine imprisonment. You think they're actually planning to escape? I know they are. I've been tracking their activities for 9 years. They're coordinating with each other through the people they've summoned, building a comprehensive understanding of contemporary human civilization. Morrison put his book away and checked his watch. The Vatican staff who monitor fragment collection 1347 BC know that someone has accessed it recently. They'll be reviewing security footage and checking access logs. You probably have 48 hours before they identify you. Then what? Then they'll try to contain the situation quietly. Vatican security is very good at making problems disappear. Morrison walked away, leaving me alone with my coffee and a growing sense of panic. The entity's presence had become painful now, like a persistent migraine that wouldn't respond to medication. I could tell it was angry about Morrison's interference. I spent the rest of the afternoon walking around Rome, trying to think through my options. The entity occasionally asked questions about things I observed, but I tried not to focus on the answers. That evening, Morrison emailed the complete ritual instructions. 12 pages of detailed procedures, material requirements, and timing specifications. The ritual had to be performed over 3 consecutive nights, starting with the new moon, which meant I had 6 days to obtain the necessary materials and plan my return to the Vatican. I spent the next day shopping for supplies. Most of the religious items were available at shops near St. Peter's Square. The cemetery soil was more challenging, but I found a church outside Rome that claimed to have been founded in the 7th century. The temple stone would have to wait until I could access the Vatican's archaeological storage. On the second day, I called my supervisor, Father Toretti. "Elena," he said, "where have you been? We've been trying to reach you for days." "I've been sick. Food poisoning. I'm feeling better now and ready to return to work." "That's good to hear. But we need to discuss some irregularities in your recent access logs. Can you come in tomorrow morning?" "Of course. Is there a problem?" "Nothing serious. Just some routine security questions." Father Toretti was lying. His tone was too careful, too neutral. They knew I had accessed room C714, and tomorrow's meeting was a trap. But I needed to get back into the Vatican anyway. The ritual required access to fragment collection 1347b, and tomorrow night was the new moon. I spent the evening preparing my equipment, the ritual materials, a small flashlight, lockpicks I'd ordered online, and a digital camera to document the process. The entity seemed to know what I was planning. Its presence became more oppressive as the night went on, and I started getting flashes of disturbing images, visions of what would happen to me if the ritual failed. I tried not to think about them too clearly. The next morning, I dressed professionally and walked to the Vatican like I was reporting for a normal day of work. Father Toretti was waiting in his office when I arrived. "Elena, please sit down. We need to discuss your recent activities." Father Toretti was a kind man in his 60s who had always treated me fairly. But today he looked uncomfortable, like someone who had been given unpleasant instructions by his superiors. "There's been some concern about unauthorized access to restricted archive areas, specifically room C714 on level C. I'm not familiar with that room number. Your access card was used to enter that room 3 times in the past month. Can you explain why?" I had prepared for this question. I was looking for additional storage space for the Psalter collection. I may have checked several rooms that turned out to be unsuitable. Room C714 contains sensitive materials that require special handling procedures. Did you examine any of the contents? I don't recall seeing anything significant, just standard storage cases. Father Toretti made notes on a pad. "Elena, I need you to understand that some areas of the archives contain materials that can be dangerous if handled improperly. Not physically dangerous, but spiritually dangerous." "What do you mean?" "Some ancient texts contain ideas, rituals, or information that can be harmful to people who encounter them without proper preparation and guidance. The Church has learned to recognize and contain such materials." Father Toretti leaned forward. "If you have been exposed to any such materials, if you have read or spoken words from texts in room C714, we can provide help. But you need to be honest with me." The entity in my mind was practically screaming now, flooding my thoughts with images of torture and death. I forced myself to remain calm. "I understand your concern, Father, but I haven't encountered anything unusual." "Very well. I'm going to have to restrict your access to level C and below pending a full security review. You can continue working with manuscripts on levels A and B. How long will the review take?" "Several weeks, possibly months. I'm sorry, Elena, but these procedures exist for everyone's protection." I spent the rest of the day working on 14th century illuminated manuscripts and waiting for the Vatican to empty out. The entity's anger was making it difficult to concentrate, but I managed to complete enough work to maintain appearances. At 6 o'clock, most of the archive staff went home. I waited until 7:30, then made my way to the archaeological storage area. The Vatican's archaeological collection occupied an entire sublevel beneath the main archives. Thousands of artifacts from excavations across the Mediterranean, most of them never displayed publicly. I found the Jerusalem collection in storage room D12. Pottery fragments, coins, pieces of stone from various periods of the city's history. The temple stones were labeled and stored in individual containers. I selected a piece about the size of my thumb and slipped it into my bag. Then I headed for level C. My access card still worked, despite Father Toretti's restrictions. Either the security update hadn't been processed yet, or someone wanted me to reach room C714. The Forbidden Bible was exactly where I had left it. I opened the climate-controlled case and began setting up my ritual materials according to Morrison's instructions. The first night's procedure was relatively simple. Light specific candles, arrange the materials in a precise pattern, recite protective prayers while touching the manuscript. The moment I began the ritual, the entity's presence became overwhelming. Images of violence flooded my mind. Threats against my mother, my friends, anyone I had ever cared about. But Morrison had warned me about this. The entity would try to stop the ritual through psychological pressure, threats, and induced fear. I had to complete the procedure regardless of what I experienced. I recited the prayers and touched the manuscript as instructed. The ancient pages felt warm under my fingers, almost alive. By the end of the first night's ritual, the entity's presence had diminished slightly. Still there, but less oppressive. I packed up my materials and left the Vatican, setting my alarm for the next evening. The second night was worse. I returned to room C714 at midnight, carrying the additional materials Morrison's instructions required. Holy water that had been blessed at 3 different churches, salt from the Dead Sea, a silver knife I'd bought from an antique dealer who claimed it had belonged to a medieval monastery. The entity knew what I was doing now. As soon as I entered the room, it began showing me visions of everyone I cared about dying in horrible ways. My mother screaming in a hospital bed. My sister's children being torn apart by invisible forces. My ex-husband Marco burning alive in his apartment. I tried to ignore the images and focus on the ritual. The second night's procedure required me to cut my palm with the silver knife and let my blood drip onto specific pages of the forbidden Bible. According to Morrison's notes, this would begin the process of severing my connection to the entity by contaminating its observation point with consecrated materials. The moment my blood touched the ancient parchment, something fundamental changed. The entity's presence didn't diminish. Instead, it became sharper, more focused, like it had been watching me through a dirty window, and suddenly the glass was clean. That wasn't supposed to happen. I checked Morrison's instructions again. The blood ritual should have weakened the connection, not strengthened it. Either I had made a mistake in the procedure, or Morrison had given me incorrect information. The entity spoke to me directly for the first time since our initial contact. "Your friend has deceived you," it said in thoughts that weren't my own. "The ritual you are performing will not break our connection. It will make our connection permanent." I stopped reading from Morrison's prayer book. What? "The man you met at the cafe is not Dr. James Morrison. He died 3 years ago. What you have been speaking with is one of us, wearing his form and using his knowledge." My hands started shaking. "That's impossible. We have been imprisoned for millennia. We have learned patience. When your Vatican researchers began finding our names and summoning us accidentally, we adapted. We began impersonating the humans who had successfully escaped our influence." The entity showed me images of the real Dr. Morrison. A thin, nervous man covered in ritual scars, living in hiding somewhere in northern Scotland. Still alive, but completely insane from his encounters with the entities. "The rituals he developed do work," the entity continued. "But the creature you met gave you a modified version. Instead of breaking your connection to us, you are binding yourself permanently to our realm." "Why would you do that?" "Because we need permanent observers in your world. Humans who are completely under our control, who can perform tasks that require physical presence." I looked at the silver knife in my hand, still wet with my blood. According to the real ritual procedures, I should have cut myself on the back of my hand, not the palm. And the blood should have been applied to a piece of temple stone, not to the manuscript itself. Every detail Morrison had given me was slightly wrong. Not wrong enough to be obviously false, but wrong enough to produce the opposite of the intended effect. I had been manipulated by an entity posing as a human expert, and now I was halfway through a ritual that would make me its permanent slave, instead of freeing me from its influence. "The third night's procedure will complete your binding," the entity explained. "After that, you will serve us willingly. You will recruit other humans to find and read from our names. You will help us gather the information we need to escape our divine imprisonment." I packed up the ritual materials and ran. Back in my apartment, I tried to research the real counter-ritual procedures. But every source I found online contradicted every other source. Some claimed that salt circles would provide protection. Others insisted that iron weapons were necessary. Still others suggested that only complete exorcism by a Catholic priest could break the connection. The entity was amused by my research efforts. "There is no escape," it told me. "The rituals developed by your scholars work only if performed correctly, and we have ensured that no correct versions remain accessible to humans who discover our names accidentally." What about the real Dr. Morrison? He escaped. Dr. Morrison performed his counter-ritual 9 years ago, before we understood how to prevent such escapes. We have since corrupted or destroyed every accurate source of information about our binding procedures. I spent the rest of the night drinking coffee and trying to think of options. The entity wanted me to return to the Vatican tomorrow night for the final ritual. It had made clear that refusal would result in the immediate death of everyone I cared about, followed by my own prolonged torture. But I couldn't complete the ritual either. Becoming the entity's permanent slave would give it a human agent who could access the Vatican archives, recruit other researchers, and accelerate the process of gathering information for the entity's eventual escape. Either choice led to disaster. At dawn, I made a decision. I called my mother in Bologna and told her to take my sister's family on an immediate vacation to somewhere far from Italy. I didn't explain why, just insisted that it was urgent and that they needed to leave the country for at least a month. Then I called Father Toretti. "Father, I need to confess something. I accessed restricted materials in room C714 and read from a manuscript I wasn't authorized to handle." Father Toretti was quiet for a long moment. "Elena, come to the Vatican immediately. Don't bring anything with you. Don't stop anywhere. Just come directly to my office." I walked to the Vatican for what I knew would be the last time. Father Toretti was waiting with two other priests I didn't recognize. Both were younger men who carried themselves like soldiers rather than scholars. "Elena," Father Toretti said gently, "tell me exactly what you did." I explained everything. Finding fragment collection 1347B, photographing and translating the text, summoning the entity by speaking its name aloud. The false Morrison, the corrupted ritual, the entity's plan to bind me permanently as its agent. The two younger priests took notes and asked detailed questions about the entity's capabilities, its communication methods, and the specific name I had pronounced. "Dr. Marchetti," one of them said, "you've encountered one of the fallen observers. These are entities that were cast out of heaven before the creation of humanity. The Vatican has been aware of their existence for centuries. Can you help me break the connection? Not break it, but we can prevent the entity from completing its binding ritual." The priest opened a briefcase containing equipment I didn't recognize. Electronic devices, what looked like medical instruments, and several vials of liquid. "The procedure will require your complete cooperation," he said, "and it will be fatal." I stared at him. What? The only way to prevent a fallen observer from completing its binding is to eliminate its human contact before the final ritual. The entity loses its ability to observe the modern world, and the binding procedure fails. Father Toretti looked sick. "Elena, I'm sorry. We should have been monitoring access to fragment collection 1347B more carefully. This situation is our responsibility. You're going to kill me? We're going to help you die in a way that serves God and protects humanity," the first priest said. "Your death will prevent the entity from gaining a permanent foothold in our world." The entity in my mind was furious now, flooding my thoughts with rage and desperation. It had invested weeks in manipulating me toward the binding ritual, and the Vatican was about to destroy its investment. What if I refuse? Then the entity will force you to complete the binding ritual tonight, and will have to eliminate you afterward anyway. This way, your death serves a purpose. I thought about the other researchers who had found fragment collection 1347B. The 7 names on Morrison's list, all reported as resignations or transfers. The others who disappeared, you killed them too? Father Toretti nodded. After they were bound to the entities, we couldn't risk leaving them alive as permanent observation points. How many people know about this? Very few. This particular problem is handled by a specialized department that doesn't appear on any organizational chart. The priest with the briefcase was preparing an injection. "The compound is designed to simulate heart failure. You'll lose consciousness quickly, and death will occur within minutes. Your family will be told you suffered a medical emergency while working late." I could feel the entity's panic. as it realized what was happening. It tried to compel me to run, to fight, to escape the Vatican before the procedure could be completed. But I was tired of being manipulated by supernatural creatures who saw humans as tools for their own purposes. Will this stop the entity permanently? It will deny the entity access to our world for at least several decades. Eventually, another researcher will find fragment collection 1347b and make the same mistake you did. But that's a problem for future generations to handle. I rolled up my sleeve and let the priest inject the compound into my arm. The effect was immediate. My vision blurred, my heart started racing, and I could feel my body shutting down system by system. The entity's presence vanished like a television being turned off. The last thing I remember was Father Toretti holding my hand and reciting prayers for the dying. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed in Switzerland. The priest who had injected me was sitting in a chair next to my bed, reading a newspaper. "Dr. Marchetti, how are you feeling? I thought you killed me. We simulated your death convincingly enough to fool the entity. The compound induces temporary cardiac arrest and neurological shutdown, but the effects are reversible if proper medical support is provided." I sat up slowly. My entire body ached like I'd been hit by a truck. The entity thinks I'm dead? The entity lost all contact with you the moment your heart stopped. As far as it knows, its human observer has been eliminated. So I'm free? You're free from the entity's influence, but you can never return to your old life. Elena Marchetti died of heart failure while working late in the Vatican archives. Her funeral was held yesterday. The priest handed me a passport with a new name and a bank account number written on a piece of paper. Your new identity is Sarah Clark, a Canadian citizen with a background in library science. You'll be relocating to Vancouver, where a position has been arranged at the University of British Columbia. What about my family? They believe you're dead. It's safer for everyone if they continue to believe that. I spent the next 2 weeks in the Swiss hospital, recovering from the temporary death procedure. The Vatican provided medical care, psychological counseling, and preparation for my new life. When I was strong enough to travel, they flew me to Vancouver and helped me establish my new identity. 6 months later, I'm working as a manuscripts librarian at UBC and living in a small apartment near the campus. I miss my family terribly, but I understand why the separation is necessary. Sometimes I wonder if other researchers will make the same mistake I did. Fragment collection 1347b is still hidden in room C714, still marked "Do Not Process," still waiting for curious scholars to ignore the warnings. But that's not my responsibility anymore. I've learned that some knowledge is too dangerous to pursue, regardless of academic curiosity or scholarly ambition. And I've learned that the Vatican's reputation for secrecy exists for good reasons. Some Bibles really are forbidden, and some rules really shouldn't be broken.